we're talking about the Wesleys. Isaac Watts was at the beginning of what Eric Routley calls evangelical hymnody. Now, that term is used differently today, but a generation after Watts, we have two Anglican priests who expand on what Watts began, and that is the Wesleys. John and Charles Wesley, brothers, and both were Anglican priests. They began what was eventually called the Methodist movement, and in their lifetimes it was just that. It was a movement within Anglicanism. Methodism did not become separate from the Church of England, from the Anglican Church, until after the death of the Wesleys. They remained Anglican priests their entire lives. Now, we tend to think of John Wesley as the preacher and Charles Wesley as the hymn writer. But John Wesley did us a great service in that he translated a lot of hymns from German. You probably know Jesus, Thy Blood and Righteousness, My Beauty Are, My Glorious Dress, which was a German hymn that Wesley translated. That one was written by Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who was the Moravian bishop, who was a close friend of Wesley's. And Wesley and the Moravians had this very mutually edifying relationship. And we have some wonderful Moravian hymns now that we sing in English because John Wesley translated them for us. Now, Charles was an incredibly prolific hymn writer, writing well over 6,000 hymns. Some estimates say around 6,500 hymns in his lifetime. And looking at the names of them here, you see that they are some of the best-known hymns of all time. "O for a Thousand Tongues," "Christ the Lord is Risen Today," "Rejoice the Lord is King," "Hark the Herald Angels Sing," which probably is the best known of all of his hymns. "You servants of God, your master proclaim." We could go on. "A charge to keep I have." We could keep going on and on and on in listing the hymns of Charles Wesley. Now, the Wesleys brought a personal dimension into hymn writing. This is a continuation of what Routley would call evangelical hymnody, although it's not related to evangelicalism of today. But this evangelical hymnody has a personal dimension to it and a warmth of expression to it that prior hymnody did not have. And we're going to go ahead and look now at two other hymn writers who continued in this tradition that the Wesleys began. So these are just a couple more names associated with 18th century English hymnody. Remember, the 18th century is the 1700s. John Newton is a name you all know. John Newton was influenced by the Wesleys and by George Whitefield, who was sort of a partner with the Wesleys for quite some time. They eventually parted ways for theological reasons, but Newton was influenced by the Wesleys, by Whitefield, but also by the devotional writings of Thomas à Kempis, who wrote The Imitation of Christ, which is sort of a mystical dimension to it. We sang Amazing Grace a couple of weeks ago, which is by Newton. Among other Newton hymns are Glorious Things of Thee Are Spoken, How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds, many, many others. By the way, just an aside, I mentioned this last week that I was going to burst your bubble because I see this video making the rounds again about Amazing Grace and the black keys of the piano. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? If you haven't seen it, you will. Your aunt will send it to you or somebody. That Newton was he was a slave trader, which was true. What's also true is that after his conversion, he did not immediately give up the slave trade. So that part is bogus. What's also bogus is that he heard the slaves in the hold of the ship singing this hymn, and it just happens that you can play it on the black keys of the piano. John Newton had nothing to do with that tune. Okay, John Newton was not a composer. John Newton did not write the hymn tune that we call New Britain, that we often sing Amazing Grace to. As a matter of fact, in Newton's day, no one knew that tune, no one sang Amazing Grace to that tune. It wasn't until the first third of the 20th century that tune was regularly associated with Amazing Grace. Up until then, it shared the spotlight with Arlington and with Pisgah, with other tunes. And besides that, the tune New Britain is an Appalachian fiddle tune that is almost certainly Celtic in origin. And this just goes to show that a lot of these beloved hymn stories that you can pick up books on and stuff are just made up of whole cloth. They are just totally made up of whole cloth. Routley used to talk about the story of the tune we call Ebenezer. And in some older hymnals, that tune is called Tone e Botel, which means tune in a bottle, because there was this story that supposedly it washed up on shore in a bottle. It's totally false. We know who wrote the song. And Routley even said that the man who wrote the tune was still alive when that story started circulating. So the moral of the story is don't believe things people share with you on Facebook. All right, so let's moving on to Cooper. And it is pronounced Cooper. It looks like Cowper, but it's not. It's Cooper. William Cooper was an important figure in hymnody during the same period as the Wesleys. William Cooper was a poet and was regarded by other British poets, including Wordsworth and Coleridge, as one of the greatest poets, English poets of the 18th century. And he and John Newton was the rector in a little village called Olney, which is in Buckinghamshire, Susan, if you're curious. He wasn't the rector, he was the curate. There's tiny church, tiny little village. And Cooper was a parishioner there. He was a poet, and the two of them collaborated on a collection of hymns that was called the Olney Hymns. So this collection was originally written for use by Newton's small congregation. Newton being an Anglican clergyman and Cooper being a poet, they made a good collaborative team for this collection. And some of Cooper's contributions to this collection were God Moves in a Mysterious Way. And we've said before, people think that's in the Bible. It's not. God Moves in Mysterious Ways. It doesn't come from the Bible. It comes from this hymn by Cooper. There is a Fountain, which we just sang a version of. He also wrote, Oh, for a Closer Walk with God. So from Watts to the Wesleys to Newton and Cooper, we have a progression in the 18th century toward what we might call more of a romantic orientation in hymnody. And I don't mean romantic like Hallmark movies. I mean romantic in the sense of expressing emotion and personal feelings. And that movement continues into the 19th century, which is where we're going next. There were going to look at four movements or developments in hymnody in the 19th century in England for the next few moments. The first one is the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was a movement within the Church of England that emphasized the historic liturgy, that emphasized the historic episcopacy of the church, and along the way rediscovered a lot of things from the Latin liturgy, including the hymnody of the Latin Church. And a lot of the old Latin hymns that we sing now, we did not know about until people like John Mason Neal translated them into English. So things like O Come, Emmanuel, All Glory, Laud, and Honor. Edward Caswall translated Jesus, the Very Thought of Thee, and When Morning Gilds the Skies. These things we did not know and would not know were it not for the Oxford movement. And then within the Oxford movement and adjacent to the Oxford movement, we have hymns for the church year. There's a renewed emphasis on that. And hymns focused on devotional piety. I want to say Hebert because I lived in Louisiana for so long. It was Heber. He was British. He wasn't a Cajun. Wrote Holy, Holy, Holy. Cardinal Newman wrote Lead, Kindly Light. And Faber wrote Faith of Our Fathers. So these people were, some of them were originally in the Oxford movement and then actually went into the Roman Catholic Church, like Faber and Newman. The next one isn't a movement so much as it is a single person, but she was and is quite important, and that is Catherine Winkworth. Catherine Winkworth, just like John Mason Neal and these other people in the Oxford movement translated all these Latin hymns for us, Catherine Winkworth translated hundreds of German hymns for us. So we would not know "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," "Praise to the Lord the Almighty," "Now Thank We All Our God." We wouldn't know these hymns at all were it not for Catherine Winkworth translating them into English for us. And Winkworth was by far not the only woman to have a significant influence on hymnody in the 19th century. Here are some women, and these women here are in England alone. We haven't even begun to discuss the U.S. or other countries. We've got Charlotte Elliott, who wrote "Just As I Am." By the way, she was an Anglican, lifelong Anglican. We associate that with a Baptist altar call. I don't think that was the case prior to Billy Graham. We've got Frances Ridley Havergal, who wrote "Take My Life and Let It Be Consecrated." Elizabeth Clophane wrote "Beneath the Cross of Jesus." And then Cecil Frances Alexander wrote so many hymns. Most of her hymns were written with children in mind, but they are so well written that they speak to all ages, not just to children. So we've got "Once in Royal David City," "All Things Bright and Beautiful," which we're going to sing after the break, "Jesus Calls Us," or "The Tumult," "There's a Green Hill Far Away," so many others by Cecil Frances Alexander. Now we're going to look at another movement in 19th century hymnody in England, and that is we have two sort of opposing movements going on in England, and after the break we'll see that there's sort of opposing movements going on in the United States too. On the one hand, we have the Oxford movement, which we talked about, with translating all the old Latin hymns and writing hymns about the seasons of the church year and things like that. But here's the other one. This is called what we call the evangelical movement. I put evangelical in quotes because it's not exactly the same as what we think of as evangelicalism today. But it does share that focus coming out of the tradition of the Wesleys and Cooper and Newton, a focus on personal piety and personal salvation, not to the exclusion of helping the poor. And the Wesleys and Whitfield and all were about helping the poor and were concerned about social ills such as alcoholism and things like that. So this is not a pietism that turns a blind eye to social concerns, but it is a movement that does have more of a focus on personal piety than we have seen previously in English hymnody. So some of the significant evangelical hymn writers of the 1800s in England: James Montgomery, who was a Moravian, wrote "Angels from the Realms of Glory" and "Go to Dark Gethsemane." Horatius Bonar was a Presbyterian, wrote "Here, O my Lord, I see thee face to face. I heard the voice of Jesus say." Thomas Kelly was Church of Ireland, which is Episcopal, and he wrote "Look Ye Saints, the sight is glorious," which is a hymn for Ascension Day, and "The head that once was crowned with thorns," also for Ascension Day. The head that once was crowned with thorns is crowned with glory now. These hymn writers have more of a focus on piety, and again, like with the Wesleys, they had a devotional warmth to them that we begin to see more of in English hymnody as the 19th century goes on.